Imagine, just for a second, handing the keys to a sprawling, massively wealthy kingdom over to a starving kid from the muddy streets. I mean, what actually happens next? Well, let's dive into it. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're using Mark Twain's classic tale, The Prince and the Pauper, as our guide to unpack a really profound concept: why perspective changes leadership styles. We're going to take a hard look at how holding authority without an intimate understanding of the people you govern just fundamentally alters the way decisions are made. And conversely, how gaining that grounded, real-world perspective can transform a leader entirely. To really get this, we have to start by looking at the extreme environmental differences between our two main subjects. We've got two boys here. They're the exact same age, they literally share the exact same face, but they are born into completely alien realities. Consider Prince Edward. He's totally bound by the velvet robes and the suffocating luxury of the Tudor court, right? He's surrounded by these rigid palace rules, totally isolated from the public, and destined from birth to hold absolute authority over everything. Then, on the completely opposite side of the spectrum is Tom Canty. He is just surviving the brutal, muddy squalor of awful court in 16th century London. He's living in crushing poverty, struggling every single day just to find his next meal, and constantly dreaming of a better life far, far away from the gutters. This stark contrast perfectly sets up our baseline. One boy holding entirely disconnected power, and the other facing the brutal, ground-level realities of the kingdom. Two boys, two worlds, separated by class, connected by curiosity. Let's see how this unfolds. Now, what's really fascinating about this narrative is how fate plays a really dangerous game when these two drastically different lives finally intersect. What actually happens when these two completely isolated worlds collide? When the absolute highest echelon of power meets the lowest rung of societal survival, everything we assume about authority gets put to the test. That brings us to the Great Switch, a simple game of identity. When the boys meet and realize, wow, we share the exact same face, a simple game of switching clothes acts as the perfect catalyst for a crash course in experiential learning. It starts out as just this innocent curiosity, swapping outfits for a minute just to see how the other half lives. But it immediately transforms into a permanent trap. The real prince, now dressed in rags, steps outside and is unceremoniously thrown into the brutal world of the poor by his very own guards. Meanwhile, Tom is completely trapped inside the palace, universally mistaken for royalty with absolutely zero preparation. To give you an idea of just how drastically unprepared Tom is, there's this brilliantly humorous moment where he's left alone in the royal chambers. Having absolutely no context for state power, Tom innocently uses the incredibly important Great Seal of England, literally the tool used to legitimize the king's rule, to crack nuts. It's wild, but it perfectly illustrates what happens when an individual is thrust into an alien environment where the symbols of power mean absolutely nothing to him. Which leads us to a massive reversal of fortune and the shock of these completely new realities. This sudden shift plunges both boys into an incredible case study of inverted realities. The impoverished dreamer, Tom, is suddenly burdened with immense state power. He's facing strict, suffocating palace rules and incredibly heavy expectations. One of the most shocking discoveries for Tom is learning that he has a whipping boy. This is another child whose sole job is to take physical beatings whenever the prince makes a mistake in his studies. Tom is just utterly horrified by this absurd, completely disconnected royal rule. Now contrast that with the real prince, who is suddenly living as a pauper. For the very first time in his life, he faces real, gnawing hunger and sheer cruelty. Every time he tries to assert his royal authority out there on the streets, he isn't respected. He's mocked, he's beaten, and he's dismissed as a madman. He learns very quickly that his authority was an illusion, tied entirely to his fancy clothes, not to any inherent respect for him as a leader. So how does perspective actually change leadership? What happens when you rule with new eyes? This is the crucial point we're exploring in this Explainer. Observing what happens to a nation when a leader actually understands the suffering of their people firsthand. Perspective in leadership is the ability to understand and rule with compassion, but specifically compassion derived directly from having lived the struggles and realities of the people being led. Because Tom has intimately lived the crushing reality of poverty, he becomes the ultimate empathetic leader. He rules with newfound compassion precisely because he intimately understands the actual human cost of the legislation he's passing. Now think about modern leadership for a moment. Whether that's in a massive corporate boardroom or in local government, how often are sweeping, life-changing decisions made from a spreadsheet by an executive who has literally never lived the reality of the people those decisions affect? We can see exactly how this grounded perspective completely changes the style and substance of how one leads. Tom's high-level decisions are entirely guided by his ground-level, lived experience. For example, when Tom is presented with an accused criminal who has been sentenced to death under a really cruel law, one that involves boiling people alive, Tom immediately abolishes the law. He actually sees the humanity in the accused and recognizes the sheer barbarism of the punishment. Meanwhile, the true prince, wandering among the poor, receives a painful but incredibly necessary education. He feels the sting of systemic injustice firsthand. He's actually beaten and thrown in jail under the very laws he previously just ignored from the comfort of his palace. Together, both boys gain a vital perspective they never ever could have learned if they had stayed in their isolated lives. It showcases that to truly see the whole picture, you absolutely have to cross the boundary of class. And that brings us to the realization that disconnected power is dangerous. The final lesson. As the coronation rapidly approaches and time runs out for the real prince to reclaim his rightful throne, the ultimate meaning of their journey crystallizes into a stark warning. It brings us to Twain's simple but incredibly powerful thesis. Power without understanding is dangerous. When leaders are entirely removed from the consequences of their actions, and when they have never actually felt the weight of the rules they impose, the resulting leadership is inherently flawed. Empathy isn't just some nice-to-have soft skill, and it certainly isn't a weakness. It's a vital, non-negotiable data point. Holding authority without an intimate, grounded understanding of those you govern isn't just inefficient, it's a recipe for disaster, and quite frankly, systemic cruelty. And that leads to this really profound realization. Those who suffer often understand justice better than those who rule. To truly understand the world and lead it justly, you can't just look at it from a balcony. You sometimes have to symbolically, or in the case of our two boys, literally, live someone else's life. Now, obviously, in the modern world, you can't magically swap lives like characters in a fable, but you can leave your office. You can get off the top floor, hit the ground floor, and actively listen to those you lead. Empathy completely changes the style, the tone, and the substance of how one leads, making it the foundational requirement for effective leadership. So, to wrap up this explainer, I've got a question for you. Based on the leadership criteria of empathy, shared experience, and perspective that we've just unpacked today, I really want you to think about who was actually better suited for the crown. Let me know in the comments. Did Tom make a better king than the prince ever could have? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer on why perspective changes leadership styles, and I will catch you on the next one.